Welcome to Chapter 15, The Ferment of Reform and Culture. My name is Dr. Chris Erskine, and I am going to lead you through this lesson. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the Second Great Awakening. There's a lot of stuff to talk about in this chapter, but I'm going to pull out this one thread because this one thread, this one theme, is so important to understanding American history, particularly during the 20th century. Now, in English, when we talk about the 20th century, we're talking about the 1900s. Probably none of you were born in the 1900s. I was born in the 1900s. My parents were born in the 1900s. And all of my grandparents were born in the 1900s. But you were probably born in the 2000s. The 2000s is the 21st century. I was born in the 20th century. The Second Great Awakening takes place in the 19th century, which is the 1800s. So let's talk about the Second Great Awakening. What was this? Well, it was a religious movement. This religious movement is really kind of hard to define. We can't always say, oh, it started in 1790 and oh, it finally ended in 1840. But if we wanted to put some start dates and end dates on it, then we can say that that's about when it was, 1790 to 1840. And so many people had new feelings about religion. They became much more religious. They started going to church more. And we're going to talk about kind of why, what was the reason that they started to do this, and what maybe was the impact. But they also rejected old religious ideas. So remember, look at the next slide. It's a picture of Andrew Jackson. Remember who's president. So we think about the last couple of chapters here. We're thinking, I want to kind of help us put some context on what we've studied over the last 2 or 3 chapters. And so the next few slides are going to be a little bit of review. And so we're going to look at here Andrew Jackson. I'm not going to talk much about Andrew Jackson. I just want you to remember he's the president from 1829 to 1837. Martin Van Buren is the president from 1837 to 1841. And 1841 takes us up to about the end of the Second Great Awakening. Of course, George Washington is president when the Second Great Awakening starts. And George Washington is the first president. And so the Second Great Awakening really lasts through the first 8 or 9 presidents that we have. Next slide, we have the Electoral College of 1808. And you can see, again, Americans are pushing west. And remember, Andrew Jackson, Jacksonian democracy, the rise of mass democracy. And so Andrew Jackson, he was a very strong leader, and a political party called the Whigs was created to kind of protest his power. At the same time, America is growing. So in 1808, you can see how many states we have. Look at the next slide, the election of 1812, and we add just a couple of states. We add Louisiana. 1816, we add a few more states. 1820, we add a few more states. So you can see that the country is gradually pushing westward. 1824, we're still pushing west. And so 1824 takes us about 15 years until the end of the Second Great Awakening. But by this time, the Second Great Awakening is really underway. Now, we talk about the Second Great Awakening. There must have been a first. Now, we would have talked about the First Great Awakening back earlier chapters, back in the early 1700s. And so we're now 100 years later. And a Great Awakening means we've woken up and seen and have become much more religious at this point. And so we're going to look at some of those. So let's look at the next slide. Second Great Awakening, 1790 to 1840. Church membership increases greatly. It doubles. The number of people going to church doubles between 1800 and 1820. And the biggest growth is among groups called Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians. And these are churches that have existed for a long time, but they're gaining new what we call new adherents, new members. And there was an event in 1833. So this is close to the end of the Second Great Awakening. There was an event in 1833 that made many people feel like the world was ending. On November 13, 1833, there was a meteor shower. Now, every November, you may have seen this as well, every November are something called the Leonid meteor showers. And usually it's only not very many meteors. If you look up in the sky, astronomers believe that you can see, not you can see, but perhaps there are 1,000 to 2,000 stars per hour, meteors per hour that are falling. Well, November 13, 1833, astronomers believe that there were perhaps 100 to 200,000 meteors per hour falling. And this is about 4 o'clock in the morning, so it's very dark. At 4 o'clock in the morning, people rush out of their homes, and it's daylight outside, and they think that the end of the world has come. And so, if you look at the next slide, you can see this is somebody's quote. This is a prophecy in the Bible. Now, at the time, these people that are really wanting to go to church more, wanting to believe in God more, and they believe that the second coming is close. The second coming means when they believe Jesus will come out of the sky and take them to heaven for the afterlife. And so they have the Bible, the Holy Bible that they read, and one of the books of the Bible, one of those is, those books, there are 66 different books in the Bible. They all have different names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And one of those is Matthew. And in Matthew, the 24th chapter, it says this: immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven. And the powers of heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. And they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And so people that were watching at 4 o'clock in the morning on November 13, 1833, they know this in Matthew. They know this verse, and they think, oh, the end is near. The Son of Man, Jesus, is coming back. The next slide. This is in Revelation. This is the very last book. So out of 66 books in the Bible, this is number 66. And it says this in the 6th chapter of Revelation. It says, and the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. I'm not going to read this whole quote. You can read this whole quote on your own. But it goes on to depict the end of time, the time when Jesus is coming back. And the key here is that the stars of heaven fell unto the earth. And that's what they were seeing at 4:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. Here's someone who started a group, a religion called the Mormons, also known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'll call them LDS, Latter-day Saints. Joseph Smith founded this group, and this is what he writes about this. I was awakened about 4 o'clock in the morning by Brother Davis, saying, Brother Joseph, come get up and see the signs of the heavens. And I arose and beheld to my great joy the stars fell from heaven. Yea, they fell like hailstones. A literal fulfillment of the Word of God. So he's thinking about Matthew, and he's thinking about Revelation. Now, that was on November 13. About a week later, he says this: nothing of note has transpired since the great signs of the heavens this day. My heart is somewhat sorrowful. So he's expecting something to happen. He's waiting, prayerfully he's waiting. Now, you'll notice in these quotes that the spelling is not correct. That's because I did not change the original spelling. I've taken the spelling exactly how these people wrote, and they didn't spell it the same way then as we do today. Looking at the next slide, Samuel Rogers. Now, Samuel Rogers was a preacher, a pastor, and he would ride on a horse around to different churches around in a large area. And one Sunday he would be over here, the next Sunday he'd be over here, the next Sunday he'd be over. He would kind of make his way. We called him a circuit preacher or circuit rider. And Elder Samuel Rogers says this: imagine large snowflakes drifting over your head so near that you can distinguish them one from the other, and yet so thick in the air as to almost obscure the sky. Then imagine each snowflake to be a meteor, leaving behind a tail like a little comet. These meteors of all sizes, from the drop of water to that of a great star, having the size of a full moon in appearance. And then you may have some faint idea of this wonderful scene. So again, they thought it was the end of time. And here's another from a school reader, a book that you would have read in school. And this was a few years after 1833. And they said this: "I was suddenly awakened to the most distressing cries that ever fell over my ears. Shrieks of horror and cries of mercy I could hear from most of the Negroes on the 3 plantations, amounting in all to 600 or 800. I then opened the door, and it is difficult to describe which excited me most, the awfulness of the scene, or the distressed cries of the Negroes. Upwards of 100 lay prostrate, meaning that they lay flat out on the ground, some speechless, and some with the most bitterest cries, but with their hands raised, imploring God to save the world and them." Again, everyone, so many people saw that. You can see on the next slide. Imagine now if you were there. What would you do if you went outside at 4 o'clock in the morning and all of the stars are falling? You may not think it's the end of the world, but you may think that someone has dropped a bomb on your city. So if this would be a very important moment in your life, and one you would never forget. So here are the questions. What are the causes? Not the causes of the meteor shower. Astronomers study the meteor shower and the Leonid meteor shower all the time, and that's something that you would study in science class. But what are the causes of the Second Great Awakening, and people so sure that the world is going to end in 1833, and so sure that the world is going to end at all? And why did they want to go to church so much? Why did they want to feel like Jesus was there with them and God was watching over them? Let's think about those for a minute. So a lot of people, a lot of historians and social scientists will tell you, let me back up just a little bit. A lot of theologians, and what is a theologian? A theologian is someone who studies religious scripture. Could be the Bible, could be the Quran, could be any other religious scripture. But a theologian is, if a theologian were asked this question, what were the causes of the Second Great Awakening? They would probably say, well, it was because the Lord's Spirit was moving among the people and convinced these people to become more religious, and He convicted on their hearts. And as a historian and a social scientists and historians would answer it differently. We would look to see what was happening in the country during that time. And we know what was happening in the country during that time. There was a lot of changes going on. There was a new country, and by 1790 we have a new country. The American Revolution has just finished. And then we fast forward about 20 or 30 years, and we have 30 or 40 years, and we have Andrew Jackson as president. Andrew Jackson is a strong president. He puts down the nullification crisis. He kills the National Bank. He pushes the Cherokee Indians all the way west to Oklahoma. And a Whig party forms because he's too powerful. So many things are happening. But also, and we talked about this in the last chapter or two, also transportation is changing. People can now move like they've never been able to move before. And so where before you were born in a town and you grew up in the same town, and your parents lived in that town, and your parents died in the hometown, and you think that you're going to live and die forever in your hometown. But your children, when they are 20, 25 years old, they get on a train or a canal and they go west or they go south. And life is changing. And any time that life changes and things are less stable, people become more religious. And this is true not only in the United States, it is true anywhere in the world, that when you feel like life is changing a lot, you're looking for something to hold on to help you feel more stable. Sometimes people look to the government to help them feel more stable. Sometimes people look to themselves to feel more stable, sometimes to money, and often people look to religion to make them feel more stable. And so other things that are happening in the 1820s, I'm looking at the causes of the Second Great Awakening as a political movement, the second slide about the causes. Remember, before 1820, most people are not voting. After 1820, more people are voting. So people feel like they have more knowledge about what's out there. More people are going to school. more people can read and write. And as people travel more because they can read and write and because they work, they begin to, the families begin to feel like they feel like they're losing control. And so they want somehow to bring religion into their life and bring things under control. And so the environment is changing. More people have a say. They get to vote. More people have opinions. When I say more people have opinions, really what I mean is more men had opinions, and more particularly white men had opinions. Because remember, 1820 to 1830, we only have about 20 million people in the United States, and only about 400,000 people of those are voting. So, mostly it's white men that own property before 1820, or perhaps go to church. And also Americans are increasingly concerned about politics. And so as they're increasingly concerned about politics, they're also becoming more involved in religion. So the next slide, religious revival and reform. So there were some new movements that came out of this. So we think about the Second Great Awakening and more people going to church. But how were they different than before? So Adventists and Jehovah's Witness, Wigham Miller is the kind of the person that kind of begins both of. He doesn't begin Adventists or Jehovah's Witness, but he begins a group called the Millerites, and from the Millerites come Adventists and Jehovah's Witness. They reject Calvinism. Now, Calvinism isn't something we've talked a lot about, but Calvinism, John Calvin, was a religious figure who the people that followed what became known as Calvinism believed that you were predestined. From the time you were born, it was already decided you were going to go to heaven or you're going to go to hell. And so the Second Great Awakening, they reject this idea. They decide that you can kind of, if you love the Lord and you behave this way, then you can decide which way you're going to go. And they also believed that Jesus was coming soon. And they also believed in temperance. And temperance is a word you should know. Temperance means not drinking too much alcohol, not smoking, not using tobacco, or not using drugs, not using, just treating yourself, being healthy, eating healthfully, eating lots of vegetables. Look at the next slide. The next group, and there's a lot of groups, and I'm only mentioning a few here. Mormonism, founded by Joseph Smith, who we saw a quote from him earlier, also rejected Calvinism, also believed in the soon return of Christ and temperance. Church of Christ, founded by Thomas and Alexander Campbell, they rejected Calvinism, and you can see that the similar things through each of these different groups. Looking at the next slide with the Shakers, very similar. Transcendentalists, now these are not people who believe in Jesus or Christ necessarily, but they believe that you can make yourself better, which was a rejection of Calvinism. They believe that if you change the way you behave, you could transcend or rise above your bad person, your bad self. We look at the next slide, we see a map of all the utopian communities in the United States at the time, or at least in the Northeast, and you can see there were so many people wanted to go to either to go to church or to become more spiritual. And so there was just this great revival during this 40-year period. And really this impacts us today. And when we say that word revival, what do we mean? If we say revivalism, that means we're kind of coming alive again. It's almost like Second Great Awakening. We've woken up. Wait, we've revived. And so in English, if we say someone was dead and the doctors, do CPR and blow into their mouth and push their chest, and they come back, we say they have been revived. They've been brought back to life. And so this word, when we talk about this, it means they have come back to Christianity. And so all of these different groups we can see here, Millerites, Mormon, Church of Christ, Shakers, other utopian communities and Advent groups. Advent means the coming of Christ. Christian Science, Advent Christians, Jehovah's Witness, and you can see the year when they began. Not all of them began by 1840, but the movement began in 1840. And for the next 30 or 40 years, we continue to have groups come to rise up out of what was the Second Great Awakening. But here's the question for you. How would you think today if people suddenly said the Lord is going to come and they began to have visions? Because Joseph Smith Ellen White, Mother Ann Lee of the Shakers, a lot of these people, they said that they had visions. They would stand there and they would say they have this dream, and they say, the Lord showed me this. So if someone walked up to you today and they said, hey, the Lord has given me a vision, what would you say? Well, I know what I would say. I would probably talk to them and walk away and think, I don't know about them. They might be a little crazy. And so this is the response that a lot of people have today. And is that a good response or a bad response? And I don't know the answer to this. This is something that I think every person has to decide for themselves. But it's different today because we don't think about people having visions as being something that is real anymore. People say that and we kind of think, nah, we don't believe that they did. So looking at, I want to just for this last slide here, I want to look at the first and the second Great Awakening, comparing the two. So the first Great Awakening, they said that if you don't behave, God is going to send you to hell. And so they told you have to behave, and you should feel guilty, you should feel bad for what you've done. With the second Great Awakening, they rejected this idea of Calvinism. They said, you're going to be able to ask for forgiveness. You're going to, the Lord loves you. He's going to forgive you. Calvin versus not Calvin. We believe in Calvinists in the first Great Awakening. We don't in the second. There's no social activism in the first Great Awakening. They preferred to drink beer more than they drank water. The second Great Awakening, they believed in temperance. And so now alcohol is a bad thing, is what they believed. Old traditions versus new traditions. But one thing that they both had in common was that they were both against Catholics. They were both what we call Protestants. Now, a Protestant, the key word here is protest. And the Protestant movement began about 500 years ago. And so they both embraced this anti-Catholic, means against Catholic feeling, because they came out of the movement that rejected the Catholic Church about 500 years ago. And this movement changed America forever. There's so many things even today that Americans do every day that we don't think about, that are connected to, and things we think about and how we think is connected to this second Great Awakening. And one example of that today is alcohol. We often think about cigarettes and alcohol as being bad for you, and certainly if you have too many, they are bad for you. Well, this idea really has its seeds in the temperance movements of between the second and the third Great Awakening. We talk about the third Great Awakening later, in several chapters later. And so that's it for this chapter, chapter 15, and we're going to see you guys next week back here for chapter 16. Until then, have fun, good luck, do well on your homework, study hard for your test. See you next time. All right, bye-bye.